Betty Boop's Bamboo Isle, 1932. 14 strange facts. They don't air anymore. Betty Boop's Bamboo Isle looks playful only if you stop thinking. Released during the anxious, unstable pre-code moment, this short hides its risks behind rhythm and ink. It was shaped by pressure, speed, and choices made without long-term reflection. In the next 14 facts, what survives is not innocence, but discomfort, preserved in frames audiences rarely revisit and even more rarely question. Fact 1. Paramount approved Bamboo Isle. Knowing this would cause distribution problems, Paramount Pictures approved Bamboo Isle, fully aware it would complicate theatrical circulation. By 1932, the distributor had already faced regional resistance to Fleischer shorts that pushed visual discomfort beyond accepted taste. Internal correspondence cited by animation historians like Richard Fleischer and Leslie Kabaga shows Paramount prioritized volume and novelty over local sensitivity. Shorts were booked rapidly, often sight unseen by exhibitors, relying on brand momentum rather than content scrutiny. The emphasis was speed. Fleischer Studios delivered on tight schedules, and Paramount accepted risks to keep screens filled during the Depression. The short's imagery did not violate any formal pre-code restriction, giving distributors legal cover while ignoring social backlash. That distinction mattered. Approval did not mean comfort, it meant the short could technically pass. Once in circulation, regional exhibitors quietly made their own decisions, skipping or delaying bookings. Paramount absorbed the friction instead of slowing production. The calculation was simple. Temporary controversy was cheaper than reworking animation already inked and synced to sound. That choice normalized discomfort as a distribution cost, and it wouldn't remain isolated. Fact 2. Max Fleischer used pre-code ambiguity to push risky racial imagery. Max Fleischer operated inside a regulatory vacuum that existed briefly before formal enforcement of the production code in 1934. That ambiguity mattered. As documented by animation historians like Leonard Moulton and Leslie Kabarga, Fleischer believed animation could go further visually because it was still dismissed as harmless. Bamboo Isle emerged from that logic. The short relied on caricature, abstraction, and rhythmic staging to mask imagery that would have raised objections in other media. Fleischer did not need explicit approval for content choices, only final clearance through Paramount's technical standards. That separation created space for risk. The animation leaned on distorted anatomy and exaggerated motion to distance the imagery from realism, a common Fleischer tactic during this period. The intent was provocation through suggestion, not explicit statement. Pre-code ambiguity allowed controversial ideas to hide in timing, music, and repetition rather than narrative framing. Once encoded into animation, these choices were difficult and expensive to undo. Fleischer understood that fact. The studio moved forward, knowing the window would soon close, and when it did, the consequences became unavoidable. Fact 3. The short was produced during severe budget compression at Fleischer Studios. By 1932, Fleischer Studios was operating under escalating financial strain, driven by Depression-era economics and Paramount's tightening distribution terms. According to archival research discussed by animation historians Richard Fleischer and Leslie Kabaga, short subject budgets had been compressed to maintain output volume rather than quality expansion. Bamboo Isle was assigned a reduced production window, forcing departments to overlap work that previously ran in sequence. Layout, animation, and ink and paint stages were pushed simultaneously, increasing error tolerance as a survival strategy. Management under Max Fleischer prioritized delivery certainty over refinement, knowing missed deadlines risked contract penalties with Paramount. This pressure reshaped creative decisions. Background complexity was minimized, cycles were reused, and staging was simplified to preserve timing accuracy for sound synchronization. Cost control quietly dictated visual language. The studio could not afford redraws prompted by cultural discomfort or exhibitor complaint. Once animation reached ink and paint, revision became financially impossible. What remained was locked by necessity, not confidence. Budget compression encouraged risk, not because the studio sought provocation, but because there was no money left to second guess. Those constraints hardened into habit, and habit shaped Fleischer's late pre-code identity. What followed exposed how fragile that balance truly was. Fact 4. Sound synchronization took priority over visual sensitivity. By 1932, 1932, Fleischer Studios treated sound synchronization as the primary technical benchmark for approval. Since adopting the optical sound system at the end of the 1920s, Max Fleischer had reorganized production to favor musical timing over visual reconsideration. In Bamboo Isle, animation was staged tightly around rhythm, repetition, and beat emphasis, locking motions early to prevent drift during post-sync. According to Leslie Kabaga's documentation of Fleischer workflows, once sound exposure sheets were finalized, visual changes became prohibitively expensive. That hierarchy mattered. Animation choices were evaluated by how cleanly they tracked music, not how they read culturally. Visual discomfort did not register as a production flaw if timing held. Rubber hose motion exaggerated forms to hit beats precisely, reinforcing imagery through repetition rather than narrative framing. Editors focused on frame accuracy, not implication. The synchronized track became an anchor. Any attempt to soften imagery would have required retiming entire sequences, something the studio could not afford under compressed schedules. As a result, sound clarity protected visual risk. What locked the rhythm also locked meaning in place, and that technical priority quietly shaped what audiences would inherit decades later. Fact 5. William Castello's recording style intensified the character's edge. William Castello's vocal performance for Betty Boop was never designed for softness. His recording style, shaped by early sound era constraints at Fleischer Studios, favored sharp enunciation and rhythmic punch over warmth. According to production analysis referenced by animation historian Leslie Kabaga, Castello recorded dialogue rapidly, often in compressed sessions designed to keep pace with animation already timed to music. That workflow mattered. Voice tracks were treated as structural elements, locking motion and pacing rather than expressing character depth. Castello's delivery carried a clipped, slightly abrasive tone that amplified the short's existing tension. In Bamboo Isle, those vocal inflections reinforced the framing instead of moderating it. There was no space for reinterpretation once exposure sheets were finalized. Fleischer's system required voices to fit animation, not the reverse. Castello adapted accordingly, prioritizing timing accuracy over nuance. By 1932, this approach was already being questioned internally, but reliability outweighed experimentation. The result was a character voice that sharpened edges already embedded in the imagery. Sound did not soften risk, it clarified it, and that clarity carried consequences the studio could not easily unwind. Fact 6. Mae Questel was navigating conflicting vocal expectations for Betty Boop. Mae Questel entered Fleischer Studios during a moment of uncertainty around Betty Boop's screen identity. By late 1931 and into 1932, internal discussions documented by animation historians such as Leslie Kabaga and traced through Fleischer payroll and casting records show the studio was dissatisfied with the rigidity of earlier vocal approaches. Questel was brought in for her flexibility, but that advantage came with pressure. She was expected to preserve Betty's established cadence while softening its harsher edges to prepare for looming censorship shifts. In Bamboo Isle, that balance remained unresolved. Questel recorded material designed to sit closer to musical timing than emotional expression, fitting animation already locked to rhythm. Her voice was directed to modulate, but never to redefine. Exposure sheets dictated placement frame by frame, leaving little room to counteract visual discomfort through performance nuance. Fleischer's system favored consistency over experimentation. Even as leadership debated a tonal shift, Questel navigated contradictory instructions. Evolve the character, but don't disrupt recognition. The result was a transitional vocal presence that neither erased prior tension nor fully reinvented Betty Boop. That unresolved compromise would soon force harder decisions at the studio level. Fact 7. Rubber hose motion was used to abstract human features intentionally. By the early 1930s, rubber hose motion was no longer just a stylistic habit at Fleischer Studios. It was a functional shield. In Bamboo Isle, elastic limbs, compressing torsos, and looping cycles were used deliberately to distance figures from anatomical realism. Animation historians such as Leslie Kabaga and John Canemaker note that abstraction allowed Fleischer artists to exaggerate without grounding imagery in believable human form. That mattered. The more elastic the body, the easier it was to slip extreme caricature past scrutiny. Forms bounced, stretched, and snapped back on rhythm, encouraging audiences to read movement as musical design rather than representation. Exposure sheets reinforced this approach by locking repetitive motion across bars of music, reducing opportunities for revision once animation began. Rubber hose motion also saved money, recycling cycles across scenes while maintaining energy. But abstraction had a side effect. It made troubling imagery harder to confront directly, hiding it inside motion and timing. What looked playful in motion became harder to justify when paused. That visual logic was intentional, not accidental, and it shaped how discomfort survived inside the short, unnoticed for decades. Fact 8. Ink and paint shortcuts allowed harmful caricature to pass faster. Inside Fleischer Studios' ink and paint department, speed was survival. By 1932, the studio relied heavily on simplification strategies to keep shorts moving through production under shrinking budgets and fixed Paramount delivery dates. According to documented Fleischer workflows described by animation historians Leslie Kabaga and Richard Fleischer, model consistency mattered less than throughput. In Bamboo Isle, line work was intentionally flattened, facial details were reduced, and contrast was pushed to read clearly on screen after optical sound exposure. These shortcuts accelerated tracing and coloring, but they also removed subtlety. Once simplified, caricature became bolder and harder to soften. Ink and paint could not reinterpret animation. It merely locked what was already approved. Departments worked from minimal reference sheets, trusting approved animation rather than questioning implication. That hierarchy discouraged intervention. Faster painting meant fewer checks, and fewer checks meant imagery advanced unchallenged. Once cells were stacked and photographed, revisiting choices was financially unrealistic. The department's efficiency masked risk as productivity. What passed cleanly through ink and paint gained institutional legitimacy simply by moving forward. And that momentum carried problematic imagery straight to the screen, without pause for reconsideration. Fact: Paramount's overseas distribution heightened the stakes of the imagery. Paramount's international booking network amplified risks that Fleischer Studios rarely controlled. By 1932, Fleischer shorts were routinely shipped overseas as part of standardized theatrical packages, often without localized review. According to distribution studies cited by animation historians like Donald Crafton, these shorts were treated as interchangeable novelty product rather than culturally specific material. Bamboo Isle entered that system unchanged. What played ambiguously in American theaters encountered different cultural readings abroad, especially in territories with colonial tensions already embedded in popular imagery. Paramount's priority was consistency. Prints were duplicated quickly, with no alternate edits prepared. Once released, exhibitors outside the United States had little guidance beyond musical appeal and runtime. Fleischer Studios was insulated from immediate feedback, while Paramount absorbed complaints quietly, treating them as regional friction rather than creative failure. That distance mattered. Domestic approval shielded the studio from confronting how imagery traveled when removed from its original context. The short's rhythm sold it globally, but its implications arrived intact. International circulation crystallized those frames into permanent artifacts. What began as local risk became global record, and those records would later define how the cartoon was judged long after its creators had moved on. Fact 10. The short reflected popular musical trends without cultural context. Bamboo Isle was built around musical patterns drawn directly from early 1930s novelty and jazz-inflected island numbers circulating in American popular culture. Fleischer Studios routinely structured shorts around whatever musical styles were commercially recognizable, prioritizing rhythmic immediacy over contextual accuracy. Animation historians, including Donald Crafton and Leslie Kabaga, note that Fleischer's sound planning treated music as a driving mechanism for motion, not as cultural material requiring interpretation. In this short, timing charts followed syncopated beats and repetitive motifs, allowing animation to loop cleanly and efficiently. That choice came with consequences. Musical shorthand replaced specificity. Motifs were lifted without commentary, framed as exotic texture rather than sourced tradition. Once locked to exposure sheets, the music dictated movement, staging, and repetition, embedding assumptions into the animation itself. There was no pause to interrogate meaning because the priority was beat alignment, not cultural understanding. Music functioned as camouflage. It softened imagery by encouraging audiences to focus on rhythm instead of representation. What felt lively and current in 1932 carried omissions that aged poorly. The short mirrored trends, not knowledge, and that absence quietly amplified the discomfort that later viewers could no longer ignore. Fact 11. Internal studio awareness did not stop the creative choices. By the time Bamboo Isle entered full production, Fleischer Studios was not operating in ignorance. Studio leadership, including Max Fleischer and supervising directors under his oversight, was aware that certain visual approaches were courting discomfort. Animation historian Leslie Kabaga documents that internal conversations at Fleischer during this period acknowledged shifting public tolerance, particularly as censorship pressure increased nationally. However, awareness did not translate into restraint. Production momentum outweighed reconsideration. Once a short entered animation, reversing decisions meant restarting exposure sheets, redrawing cycles, and resynchronizing sound, all expenses the studio could not absorb. Creative departments deferred to prior approvals rather than reopening debate. Paramount's approval served as psychological closure, signaling that risk had been transactionally accepted. Ink and paint, editorial, and sound teams operated under the assumption that creative decisions above them were settled. This structure insulated individuals from responsibility while allowing controversial material to advance. Discomfort became diffuse, belonging to the system rather than any single decision maker. By normalizing forward motion, the studio converted hesitation into silence. What survived was not ignorance, but acquiescence, and that pattern would soon collide with a tightening regulatory climate that offered far less flexibility. Fact 12. Later, television prints quietly removed or withheld the short. When Fleischer shorts transitioned from theatrical circulation to television packages decades later, Bamboo Isle became a quiet complication. By the 1950s and early 1960s, syndicated cartoon libraries were curated with an eye toward advertiser comfort rather than historical completeness, as documented by animation historians such as Jerry Beck and detailed in Paramount's post-theatrical handling of Fleischer material. Certain shorts were simply excluded rather than formally censored. Bamboo Isle was among those that rarely circulated. No public recall was issued. No explanation accompanied its absence. Television distributors selected safer Betty Boop entries, allowing the character's image to soften through repetition, while harder titles faded from visibility. Editing the short would have required intervention into locked sound and timing, so avoidance became the cheaper option. Over time, absence rewrote reputation. Viewers encountering Betty Boop on television inherited a filtered version, disconnected from earlier risks. The short survived primarily in archives and private collections, not mainstream rotation. This selective disappearance reframed history without altering a single frame. What was missing spoke as loudly as what remained, and that silence reshaped nostalgia more effectively than overt censorship ever could. Fact 13. The cartoon became a reference point in Fleischer retrospectives. As Fleischer Studios' legacy began to be reassessed by historians and preservationists in the late 20th century, Bamboo Isle emerged less as a celebrated short than as a point of unease. Retrospectives organized around Betty Boop often referenced the cartoon indirectly, using it as an example of how far pre-code Fleischer material could drift from later standards. Animation historians, including Leslie Kabaga and Richard Fleischer, have noted that discussion of such shorts tended to occur in academic or archival settings rather than public presentations. The short complicated celebratory narratives. It disrupted attempts to frame Fleischer output as merely playful innovation. Preservation efforts focused on completeness rather than endorsement, treating Bamboo Isle as a document of studio practice under pressure. Its continued presence in archives forced curators to address uncomfortable context instead of erasing it. Unlike titles restored for television or home video prominence, this cartoon was cited more often in footnotes, lectures, and restoration notes than in curated programs. Its reputation became analytical rather than nostalgic. What survived was not affection, but obligation. In confronting it, historians acknowledged risk as part of the Fleischer method, not an anomaly. And that acknowledgement continues to complicate how the studio's history is told today. Fact 14. Bamboo Isle still complicates shapes Betty Boop's cultural legacy today. Nearly a century after its release, Bamboo Isle continues to resist comfortable framing within Betty Boop's legacy. Preservation has kept the short intact, but context has shifted. Animation historians such as Jerry Beck and Leslie Kabaga note that Betty Boop is now marketed primarily through softened imagery, stripped of her pre-code volatility. This short refuses that revision. Its frames expose how Fleischer Studios balanced commercial pressure, novelty, and cultural blind spots without hesitation. When screened today in archival or academic contexts, Bamboo Isle interrupts nostalgia rather than serving it. The animation's timing, sound lock, and caricature are historically accurate yet emotionally destabilizing. That tension forces reassessment. Betty Boop was not a fixed symbol, but a moving target shaped by economic urgency and loose standards. The short demonstrates how animation absorbed mainstream assumptions faster than it questioned them. It also reveals why later curation avoided acknowledgement instead of explanation. The discomfort endures because the work was never corrected, only sidelined. Bamboo Isle remains less a relic than a challenge, asking viewers to separate affection from examination. And that unresolved friction defines its place in animation history. Bamboo Isle survives as an uncomfortable reminder that early animation was never neutral. It was shaped by pressure, speed, and blind spots that modern nostalgia prefers to erase. Betty Boop's image became safer over time, but this short resists that rewrite. It exposes how risk, avoidance, and silence built legacies alongside innovation. Remembering it honestly requires sitting with unease, not smoothing it away.